Welcome everyone. My name is Stephanie Chu and I am the Program Officer for the Women PeaceMakers program. The Women PeaceMakers program is one of the Institute for Peace and Justice's award-winning flagship programs. In 13 years, we've warmly welcomed 50 women from 36 countries around the world. When the women come here, they come here to document their stories and their best practices of peacemaking efforts in their communities. Women on the front lines work tirelessly, so they seldom have time to record their activities, their experiences, and their insights. When they come to the University of San Diego, we offer them time to rest, reflect, and have respite. Each peacemaker is paired with a peace writer who sits with them every day and asks them questions, listens, and then crafts their stories into narratives that are shared around the world with academics, policymakers, peace practitioners, high school students, universities, and the general public. In addition, peacemakers come here to connect with audiences, to connect with the community here at the University of San Diego, and to connect with the wider San Diego circles, which is what we're doing here today. The conversations are a very special opportunity for people to come and hear in depth about the work the peacemakers have been doing in their communities and to hear about their life experiences, ranging from childhood, their current work, and their past work. So I was speaking to a friend the other day who saw our peacemakers at the panel that we had 2 weeks ago, and she came away and described them as marvelously magnificent people. She's a writer, so she likes alliteration. And I think that was very well-deserved praise, but in some ways it doesn't quite capture everything about these women. They are magnificent, but they're also incredibly resourceful, intelligent, creative, visionary, innovative. Did I say intelligent? They're so hardworking, and we're very, very lucky to have them with us here for the residency, for the 10 weeks, 11 weeks that they're here, and here to share a conversation with us. So I would like to introduce the peacemakers in our audience today. Judge Najla Ayubi from Afghanistan. Galia Golan from Israel. And Pauline Dempers from Namibia. And they're writers who write their stories. Claire Doran, there she is. Maggie Thatch, Jenna Whiskey Barnett, and Gabrielle Clifford, who will be joining us. So now for our final peacemaker, Glenda Wildschut from South Africa. She's been a nurse, a midwife, a psychiatric nurse, director at the University of Cape Town, and a lieutenant colonel. And if you want to find out more about that, you can ask her later. Glenda's work dates back to the early 1980s, where she began working with political prisoners, their families, exiles, and orphan children. She pioneered the first trauma centre for survivors of violence and torture, and since then she's dedicated herself to work in human rights, reconciliation, and healing. Joining Glenda in a short while will be our special guest, Mike Williams, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. He's an expert in South African politics and democratisation, among other things, and I'll share with you some more information later. But please give a very warm and enthusiastic welcome to Glenda Wildschut from South Africa.
That was such a generous welcome, and now I have to remember to switch on my microphone. I thought I would be able to do it elegantly.
So, thank you so much for joining us, Glenda. You've had so many different roles in your career. but one of the standout lifetime roles, if you like, was as a commissioner on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa.
Yes.
So just a brief background, we'll be watching a video later, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up by Nelson Mandela and led by Desmond Tutu. It was set up after more than 40 years of an apartheid era in South Africa where there were gross human rights violations. And South Africa introduced this mechanism to promote healing and forgiveness and reconciliation and unity. They chose not to go down the retributive punishment path. It was completely unique at the time, and it's still regarded as a great success and innovative for what it did in that period of transitional justice. So Glenda was appointed, handpicked by Nelson Mandela to be one of the 17 commissioners on that commission. Please tell us, Glenda, I'm so curious, what was it like when Nelson Mandela called you and said, Glenda, I'd like you to be on the commission? Was it a surprise? How did you feel?
It was a great, great surprise. I wasn't expecting it, although the legislation made provision for nominations from civil society, and there were some 250 nominations, and then 40 of us were interviewed by a multi-party panel, multi-political party panel, and the panel sent 25 names to Nelson Mandela, and he chose 17 of us. I think the one thing about the Truth Commission and the selection of the commissioners, you know, of course, that there were commissions in Latin America, and most of the commissioners had a legal background or social science background, or somehow politically connected. I think I am still the only nurse on a Truth Commission, so I think that was for me also an honor that someone from my profession was able to do the kind of transitional justice work on the TRC. I had met Mandela before, obviously, through my work in when the political prisoners were released from Robben Island. And he was obviously aware of the work because we had worked with political prisoners on Robben Island, preparing them to be released back into mainland and back into civil life. And we had, had to go over the ocean. You know, it's like, I suppose, Alcatraz, where you have to travel a little while on a boat to the island. And many of the people who had to go onto the island, in fact, came from inland and had never been on and the Department of Correctional Services at the time provided a very rickety boat for the families to go over to the island to visit their loved ones. So we always tried to provide support for the families as they would go across to visit on the island. And in that work, of course, Madeba knew about what we were doing. And so when I met with him before he became president, he told me, I know all about your work, and I'm very proud of you, and I'm very proud of the work that you are doing. So I guess that was the prelude or the sort of forerunner to my appointment as a commissioner. Yeah.
Wow, what a story. Thank you. And Glenda, so you mentioned you have a background in nursing. In 1978, you were recognised as the top nurse in the country after you completed training in psychiatry. And then in 2001, You were recognised by the International Council of Nursing as one of the 3 best nurses in South Africa for a 10-year period, for a decade. But it wasn't always an easy path. You came up against some obstacles as a student, particularly during the time of protest when a lot of students were becoming conscious about the political oppression. Can you tell us about some of the discrimination you faced during that time?
Yeah. You know, of course, that all our education was racially divided. So there were training schools for whites, and training schools for blacks, and training schools for coloreds, and training school for Indians. And so I had to go to a university which we called a Bush University. It was a university that was set up for coloreds, and of course to give us inferior training. But politically, the university actually became the intellectual home of the left. And so there was a lot of political protest and so on. Nursing is generally a very conservative profession. And so, of course, you have your sort of clinical training, and then you also have your academic training. And so I got politically involved and went to all the protests, rallies, and so on. And this particular rally, my photo appeared in the front page of the newspaper, and my professor and the clinical head, of course, saw this in the newspaper and called me to the office, and she was extremely angry. How dare you get involved politically? You are so stupid to be involved, and you just will never, I mean, she insulted me. You'll never make it. You're just too stupid to do this course, and so on. Of course, I flunked all the nursing courses. Not because I didn't have the intelligence, but because, of course, they were ensuring that I don't make it. So fast forward to 78, I topped the national exam.
You changed schools.
I had to change schools, of course, and go to a college. And then I became the top nurse in psychiatry in the country. But the 2001 accolade from the International Council of Nursing was actually one of the 3 best nurses of the decade internationally, not just nationally.
Wow.
And that honor was part of ICN, the International Council of Nursing's centenary celebrations. So it was really very special that I, together with 2 other nurses, one from the US and one from Germany, were honored as the 3 best nurses of the decade. And in that we were obviously introduced to the patron of ICN, who is Princess Margaret at the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So, of course, you can imagine I had a very interesting internal conversation with this woman who told me I'm stupid. Because I had already, well, when she dismissed me after that really terrible conversation, I made up my mind that I'm going to prove to her. And my internal conversation was, you were my greatest inspiration, because you spurred me on to be the best that I can be. And I'm very proud that I am the best that I can be. Yeah.
Fantastic. And let's rewind a little bit to your family, to your childhood.
Yes.
You had a really special relationship with your grandfather. Yeah, can you tell us a bit about him?
Yeah.
About the relationship you had?
So, I really love music. I'm very most of what I do is with music. And I think that he's the person that instilled that in me. He was a worker, but he played the violin very beautifully. And I think that if we didn't have apartheid, I think my grandfather could have been a member of the Cape Town Symphony Orchestra and been a violinist in the Cape Town Symphony Orchestra. He was that good. But of course, it was not to be. And he taught me so much about music. He would play the violin and show me various techniques, bowing techniques, pizzicato, all kinds of different violin techniques. He told me all about the music that he was playing, and he used to play it for me with such passion, and we would have these conversations. I mean, I was very young. I think I was about 12 years old when he passed on, but my early childhood was often spent with him, you know, sharing these gems with me. And he was quite resourceful. He wanted to, you know, hear music and so on. So he befriended the ushers at the City Hall, where the orchestra played. And after the opening and the doors were shut, the ushers would allow him to come in and sit right at the back. So he was able to, on a Thursday evening, that's when the symphony concerts were, on a Thursday evening listen to the symphony concerts by befriending the ushers and sitting at the back of the hall.
And if he was sitting here today, what would he say about who Glenda was as a young girl? How would he describe you?
So Grandpa was a man of very few words. So he wouldn't say much. He would just beam, I think, and just, you know, just say, that's my goal.
So I've been speaking to your writer, Maggie, about some of, you know, the narratives that are coming out, and it seems very much that you have a pattern of using your power to give other people agency. And sometimes in controversial situations. So there was one particular example that I wanted to ask you about. It was 1985 in a township called Pabalelo, next to Uppington, and there was some people that were protesting, and there was a young police officer, black police officer, Lucas Setawala, did I say that correctly? And he attacked the crowd, and then the crowd turned ugly and attacked him, and he was set alight and murdered. 25 people, 26 people were accused of his murder, not all rightly accused. And after that, there was a big case. But there was one particular person's voice that you advocated very strongly to hear, Lucas's mother, Mrs. Setawala. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're quite right. I mean, it was a very, very terrible event that happened in Uppington at that time. And following that event, you know, it attracted international attention because the 26 were charged by a common purpose. It's a principle in law where people are sufficiently in common agreement to perpetrate a particular act. And of course, these people were just rounded up by the police. Many of them, in fact, were not even on the scene when this event happened, including two very old people who were illiterate and didn't even understand what was happening. But throughout all of this, I felt during the hearings that, or when we were preparing for the hearings in Uppington, that the mother of the police person who was killed, her story was not being heard. She was completely isolated from the community. Not even her pastor in the church prayed for her. And she testified to that effect at the hearing. And I was determined to hear her story. So I met with her and told her that I wanted to hear her story. And I felt that her grief and her loss has not been acknowledged. She was very surprised that we came to meet with her, and eventually agreed that she would testify at the hearings. I facilitated that testimony, and in fact, when I was talking to Maggie, it surprised me that I forgot that I was facilitating the testimony. Anyway, and she, for the first time, had the opportunity in a public space and in a space where she could be acknowledged, told her story. And I think that for me, the lesson is that in peace work, we have to hear all sides of the story. We cannot be partisan and only hear one side of the story, that in our work we need to be able to hear all sides of the story. Because her grief was as intense and as painful as the loss of the others who had lost lives.
Thank you, Glenda. So, thank you so much for sharing all of those stories. Yeah. I'd like to welcome Mike Williams to the stage now. Mike has studied at this university and he's been teaching here since 1999. As I mentioned, he's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and he's director of the PeaceMaker Hub. His research focuses on African politics with special interests in democratization, indigenous political structures, local governance, rule of law, the courts, and constitutionalism. He's published numerous articles and a book on the chieftaincy in South Africa, and he's also been traveling to South Africa every year since 2003, as well as taking a group of USD students every summer for a decade, where they collaborate with high school students in the village of Makuleke in South Africa. Please give him a warm welcome. So we'd like to show you a video now to give you some background, some more background to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then Mike and Glenda are going to have a great conversation where we hear more about that and its relevance today, and there'll be opportunities for you to ask questions as well.
After centuries of white domination and decades of apartheid, the political leaders of white and black South Africans agreed to negotiate a political settlement after the unbanning of the liberation movements and the freeing of political prisoners in 1990. By early 1994, after 4 years of talks and negotiations, the different parties agreed to an interim constitution and an election, which was held on 27 April 1994. Nelson Mandela was sworn in as the country's first democratic president. But how was South Africa going to deal with its violent and oppressive past? Simply burying it and trying to forget it, while allowing all those who had committed gross human rights violations in the name of politics to get away with it, were not seen as options. Accountability was a prerequisite for a human rights culture in the new democracy. Some argued strongly for criminal trials for former soldiers, policemen, and their commanders and political bosses, referring to the trials of Nazi war criminals after World War II as example. But it was important to take the white minority along into the New Deal, and even more important for the apartheid security forces to accept a change of political power to the majority. Parliament then came up with a compromise which would reveal and acknowledge the past, but would also promote reconciliation and offer amnesty to perpetrators in return for the truth. the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act of 1995 created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that had to facilitate this process. Nobel Peace Prize winner Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu was appointed chairperson of the Truth Commission. President Mandela then selected the 17 Truth Commissioners from a short list of 25 names that had been chosen by a multi-party panel. The Truth Commission was also tasked with painting a picture of the past so that the causes, nature and extent of political violence could be better understood. The Commission therefore held special hearings and invited role players on all sides of the conflict to make submissions. Special hearings were held on prisons, women, children, the State Security Council, the military and police, the different political parties, the media, the medical profession, the religious communities, and even the behavior of Winnie Mandela's Mandela United Football Club in Soweto in the late 1980s. The Commission had 3 committees overseeing its 3 functions: a Human Rights Violations Committee, an Amnesty Committee, and a Reparation and Rehabilitation Committee. The Human Rights Violations Committee investigated the human rights abuses that occurred in South Africa between 1961 and 1994. Agents of the Commission went into the communities to gather statements from people who were victims or survivors of politically motivated violence. More than 21,000 such statements were gathered. Of these, about 2,000 were invited to tell their stories at public hearings of the Commission. These hearings took place all over South Africa between 1996 and 1998.
It all began here on 15 April 1996 in the Eastern Cape, the womb of apartheid resistance over decades. Here, in the glare of the world's media, they stepped where no one had gone before, and they spoke the first words in the great telling of our shameful and proud past. There were the wounded and the pained.
And I was still 20 at the time, and I couldn't handle this. So I was taken to Nyami's place, and when I got there, Nyami was crying terribly.
And then there were those with great loss in their hearts and anger in their veins.
I don't want to cry. Really, I don't want to cry, but I would like the Commission to help me.
They were the brave pioneers of the Truth Commission, those who led all the others to sew their truths into the patchwork quilt of a new history.
There's been a lot of evil. There's been a lot of evil in this country. It's being exorcised.
The Commission sat in noisy cities and quiet dorpies. They sat in big, imposing town halls and dingy schools and churches, from Messina in the north to Cape Town in the south. And from everywhere the victims came. Some were dignified, silver-haired elders, others impassioned young lions. Sometimes there were even small little lions. The stories were of torture and abduction, rumors that became reality.
This is Piwo's hair. This is the scalp.
They spoke about massacres and wars. They spoke about the death of a single child and about the killing of whole families.
I heard their voices. No one screamed twice. Each one screamed just once. Then I'd hear the next one, and another one, until they finished them all.
There were those who wept about loved ones who disappeared without a trace. But the common thread was that everywhere the extent of the horror was more than anyone had ever suspected. Even the smallest village had its casualties. The process was not easy. Often the truth was frightening. As the process gained momentum, victims sometimes came face to face with perpetrators and the grim reality of what they did. Few remained untouched as the floodgates of emotion were wedged open.
It is 25 years now, and that I will not forget what happened. I ask the Almighty that I will not forget what happened and that I need to know.
I remember pain of a scale that I didn't think a human being could ever experience.
So I would just crawl into the toilet and drink from the toilet sink.
There were the cynics, of course. Some called it the Crying Commission, but often they were white or old allies of apartheid and scared of the guilt that came with hearing the truth. But then there were those who became part of the telling, and through that, some sort of reconciliation.
U het in die harte van verwonde, soms verpletterde mense ingekry. My en my kinders verhaal is klein in vergelyking met soveel ander vir wie ons harte bloei. Ons swaar kry is maar 'n druppel in die Suid-Afrikaanse emmer.
But what did all these who came to bear their souls seek? For many it was simply enough to tell their story to a nation whose time it was to listen. Others wanted to lay the past to rest. Again and again they asked for the remains of those who had disappeared. For some, like the family of murdered ANC cadre Phila Ndwandwe, this became a terrible reality. For others, the bones were lost forever, dumped into this river. But knowing this was the beginning of the ending for them.
So perhaps we can start off by just, Mike and Glenda, maybe you could comment on, 20 years after that whole process, how is South Africa doing?
Well, it seems what's remarkable about South Africa today is that when you look back at that footage, which is... Sorry, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay. No? Okay.
Is it
I think
on?
it is on.
It is on.
Yeah, he said he could adjust the volume up there. Okay. South Africa today is, given what we just saw, remarkably stable politically, it seems to me. Its institutions seem strong, and the political elites, for the most part, seem to support the democratic process. And I think that's, if you asked many people 20 years ago whether we'd be saying that today, I think there would be many different opinions on that. I think like many democracies today, South Africa has numerous challenges. I think South Africa has challenges in terms of its economy, in terms of its education, and in terms of its violence. But for the most part, I would say South Africa has done remarkably well coming from where it came from apartheid. And I know I want to talk to you about South Africa today, and I promise that's going to be my next question. But that footage is so moving, and I've been fortunate to watch that with you twice now in preparation, and and to see your face both beam and some sadness as you watch that. And so I just want to start off and ask you, looking back at that process, if there was something that the Commission could have done differently, given what you know now about South Africa, what would that be?
Yes, that's a very difficult question, because we were actually charting very new territory. The commissions that were held in Latin America, which preceded the South African Truth Commission, those commissions were very different from ours. Firstly, in that in all of the Latin American situations, amnesty was granted by decree. Particularly, I suppose the Chilean model was closest to the South African one. Pinochet indemnified all the security personnel, including himself. So there was no process to understand from the side of the perpetrators what had happened. That commission only listened to the stories of victims. In the South African situation, we were able to have what was conditional amnesty, and so the amnesties were granted by request. And if the applicant met the very strict criteria for amnesty, and I won't go into that because it's quite legalistic, if they met the criteria, they would be granted amnesty. So there were some 7,500 applications for amnesty, and about 1,000 or so were granted amnesty, just more than 1,000. So you can imagine it was a very arduous process. So, but linked to that, I always believe that if you have an amnesty process, then there must be a very good compensation process for the victims, because the perpetrator is indemnified through the process of application during the life of the commission, but the legislation did not make it possible for the commission to grant reparations. So the commission could only make recommendation to the current government about what reparations should be granted to the victims. So while it was seen that the commission could set someone free by an indemnity process, the victims did not receive immediate reparations. So that is something that I think should be different. And then there are some procedural things that I think should be different, but the link between amnesty and reparation for me is a very important one.
Yeah.
And you know, of course, that the commission was established during Mandela's time, but we handed in our report and the recommendations after the life of the commission, which was in a new dispensation with Thabo Mbeki at the helm at the time, yes.
Yeah, and we've been talking about the notion of reparations, about how you can see reparations as narrowly in terms of those who were victims. But you've also talked to me about how you see reparations in a much broader sense.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk about that.
So, you know, we only had about 22,000 victims declared through the process, and the Truth Commission only looked at gross violations of human rights, which are defined by the United Nations as murder, abductions or disappearances, severe ill treatment, and torture. So that definition applied to the work of the Truth Commission. But apartheid was far more devastating than just those gross violations of human rights. It impacted on cultural rights, on linguistic rights, on land rights, on all kinds of other social rights. So the dilemma for any new government is how do we actually have what is distributive justice? In other words, how do we provide for everyone? And so while compensation, of course, must be given to those who had suffered gross violations of human rights, but the new government actually inherited an empty pantry. I told you before that we had 14 administrations for each sector. So we had 14 departments or ministries of health, 14 ministries of education, 14 ministries of whatever in the old dispensation. Because of course we had the homelands and the various racially divided ministries. And South Africa was corrupt at the time, not bankrupt at the time, corrupt too, bankrupt at the time of the new dispensation. And so that decision about how we distribute what little resources we have amongst everyone so that everyone could benefit from the new dispensation was a dilemma for the new government.
Yeah. And I know one of the areas the South African government has devoted a lot of resources has been education.
Yes.
I think it's the largest amount in the budget each year. And there have been some gains, but there's also still highly unequal educational opportunities in South Africa. Just to give some brief examples here, those with high school education or higher today in South Africa, it's 14% of Black South Africans, while 65% of whites. Higher education just by itself, Blacks 5.2% and whites 31%. And then just the village of Makoleke, where we take students, 1.5% of the village have any higher education at all. So I wonder if you could just comment on this dedication of resources to education, but then your thoughts on the actual improvement for the lives of ordinary people in terms of education.
So, I mean, on one hand, it's the issue of sort of resources, schools, building schools, ensuring that there are those kind of facilities that one needs for education. The other thing is that I feel that there's not enough resources allocated to early childhood education. Mm-hmm. So once the young people arrive in junior school and so on, there's already a deficit. So issues around calculus and maths and science is a huge problem in the education system. The other thing, of course, is that we are still suffering the legacy of poor education of the teachers. So the educators themselves have a deficit. And you will know, of course, that there was one study recently done that most of the educators cannot do grade 10 calculus, math. So we are having educators who have come through Bantu education, come through Black education, poor education, who themselves are needing upgrading and improving. And that is impacting so much on the quality of the education we have now. But you will know that there's a huge summit on at the moment, especially around higher education. Universities have a big problem. We have an almost 30% failure rate of Black students who have come through Black education. So even in universities, we have to put in really a lot of resources to bring those students up and have articulated courses for them to be able to succeed.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I know that in the United States there seems to be, in our attempts to address social justice issues, sometimes it seems that citizens get tired or they think, time's up, right? And while it's only been 20 years in South Africa, it's still been 20 years, and the programs we're talking about is a shifting of resources from those with the resources to those without, which is still very much based on race. And I'm wondering what's your perspective in terms of those with the means in South Africa today. Is there a feeling of this as if we've done enough now and that we should be let off the hook, that you can't keep asking us to give our resources over and over again, or not?
As an activist, and it's a great question, as an activist I always say, where did they get the resources wrong? And so how have those resources been obtained? Through the blood and sweat of blacks. You know, people working in the mines, working in industry and so on. Most of the labor force, of course, are blacks. But the disparities between the salaries of these people are huge. And if you look at the kind of salaries that CEOs of huge companies earn compared to the workers. So, and of course there's this huge debate on at the moment about affirmative action. And with this affirmative action, people are saying we have to stop it now 20 years, we can't have equal employment equity legislation. People are tired of having to sort of step back and allow people from disadvantaged communities to now step into the breaches. So I think we have a long way to go. I don't think that we should end employment equity. We should. In fact, I think we should be much more robust in the way in which we apply the employment equity legislation. And then there should be, there was talk about a wealth tax. And many people who are now saying that there should be, even if it's a once-off wealth tax, that there should be a wealth tax which can go into social welfare, particularly into housing. We have a huge housing problem, into the issues of land distribution. So, yeah.
So we might take some questions from the audience now, and then Glenda and Mike can start talking again. Feel free to ask Mike questions. He's been someone over here? Sure. We've got a mic, if you don't mind. So before you ask your question, could you introduce yourself, please? Let us know your name and where you're from.
My name is Jim Gump, and I'm in the history department. And I think I know Mike.
Yeah, we know each other.
So first of all, I want to really salute you for your work on the TRC. And I think that as an example of a society trying to confront the past, I think Americans could learn a lot from that process. And one of the constraints in the hearings was that you had to depend upon perpetrators of violence coming forward to seek amnesty. One who was denied amnesty, was Eugene de Kock. And he was, for those of you who don't know him, he was the commander of a secret police unit during apartheid that basically was a death squad. And he was responsible for a number of murders himself. But he was recently paroled. So I wonder if you could comment on specifically that, and then the whole phenomenon of trying to bring people forward who were responsible for state-sponsored violence, who may have been gotten off scot-free.
Was there a question for Mike in the beginning?
He doesn't want to hear me talk on this.
So, just by way of a little bit, and a very good context to the Eugene de Kock story. In fact, you saw in the clip that we had several sectoral hearings and political party hearings. The National Party also presented to the TRC. And at that presentation, F.W. de Klerk, who was the president at the time of the transition, and who received a Nobel Peace Prize together with Nelson Mandela. Now, I'm not going to say what my feelings are about him receiving a Nobel Peace Prize together with Nelson Mandela, but I will tell you this. He came to the commission and told the commission that actually apartheid was wholesome, and that he was not coming to the commission to apologize for the system of apartheid. He told the commission that actually in the security forces there were a few bad apples. So he then talked about the bad apple theory. Now, the State Security Council was a cabinet council that in fact was very well attended, and Mr. de Klerk was a member of the State Security Council. State Security Council gave all the commands for all the operations that happened, including the establishment of Vlakplaas, which is the place that Eugene de Kock was the commander of. This, it was a killing farm, a real killing farm, including cultivating crocodiles to which cadres were fed on this killing farm. Now, Eugene de Kock was not then backed politically in his application for amnesty. He was not backed because he didn't have the political backing of the top echelons. And he came, and together with some other members of the State Security Council, actually revealed quite a lot of what was going. What was happening. There were several people. So, and Eugene de Kock, in fact, had killed more than 100 people individually, not just as a commander individually. So his amnesty application was only for a few, because you know, of course, for the amnesty you have to apply for every single event that you, or every single violation that you had perpetrated. He was already in jail and had received several life sentences, which he still continued to serve. My colleague Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela has written a book about her encounter with Eugene de Kock, and people might want to read the book. It's called A Human Being Died That Night. And it's very compelling reading. So, you know, that's as much as I can say by way of that. He was paroled. He's really had a change of heart, and he's met with victims. He's asked for forgiveness, and Pumla has in fact facilitated quite a lot of those conversations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kate Lee, and I'm a graduate student here in Peace and Justice Studies program. And my question is, so Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what they did in South Africa is brought the perpetrators and victims of that apartheid together, and it just seems to me when those people accept what they did wrong and say like, yeah, I am the one who killed your brother or like your husband, I'm sorry. So like, does it really, what does it really mean to people, to victims? And my question is, how would you evaluate the work of TRC in terms of reconciliation? You know, how much it did? Was it successful in order to reconcile the community? You know, when people would say, oh, I feel better right now, like, now I know you accept the guilt, like, you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. I do know what you mean, because and the way in which I understand your question is that can reconciliation happen just when somebody gets up and says, you know, I'm sorry I did this and so You will have noticed in the clip that the name of the act, the legal instrument, was called the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation. The act was not called the Achievement of National Unity and Reconciliation. And that was precisely what we were doing. We were not there to achieve national reconciliation and healing. It is only one instrument in a range of other activities that should happen in a new democracy or in a transitional justice process that works towards national healing and reconciliation. A truth commission is not the panacea for all evils or for all ills. A truth commission is an instrument towards peace and reconciliation. So the act also did not legislate that people should ask for forgiveness. The act legislated that people should tell the whole truth. That was all the act said. The act says that in order to receive amnesty, you have to give full disclosure, including who told you to do what you did, and whether you belong to a legitimate political formation, and whether you committed the act with a political intention. So criminal acts, and there was a distinction we made between criminal acts and political acts. Those acts, criminal acts, were for criminal prosecutions. These acts were only were given amnesty only if they could prove that this was a political act with a political motive. So it's a long answer to, I mean, I always ask people when they ask me that question, how much time do you have? Because it's a really long answer in trying to understand what it is that such a transitional justice process does in a new democracy.
Can I just add, and I know you know this, Desmond Tutu would often talk about this process as restorative justice. So it's a different sense of justice. And on this movie Long Night's Journey Today, he says, you know, people are not getting off scot-free. They have to disclose, and then they have to, if they're granted amnesty, live in society where everyone knows this about them. And so what Glenda was saying about Eugene de Kock, it's incredible. He's out of prison now, but now he's living in South African society where everyone knows what he did and who he is. And Desmond Tutu believed that that is a sense of justice, and that is a sense of, punishment's the wrong word, but to live with that is something that we should not take lightly. Mm-hmm.
And to live with that in a country with issues of shame, in a Calvinistic society where the notions of shame is very interesting. And so you are known and you're publicly shamed for what you have done is great punishment for somebody coming from such a society.
Mike, I'd like to get your insights now. You've been going back to South Africa every year for over a decade, and you've been working a lot with youth. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what you've noticed, how it's been changing, what you've noticed about the young generation coming through, and how this process may or may not have affected them?
Sure. Myself and colleagues, we work with high school students, South African high school students. So these are a generation that are known as the born frees. They're a generation that were either born, in this case, after apartheid ended. And what's been remarkable for me as we get to know these young people is how much of this history they don't know, and how much they're asking me to tell them about Mandela or Steve Biko or the TRC process, because they're either not learning it in their schools, or their parents or grandparents are either not telling them, or they're not being asked to tell those stories. So there is I think it's the same thing we find with younger people in the United States, that there is a growing disconnect with the history, and with this notion that they're intricately tied to that history. Their lives right now in the village of Makaleke is a result of the legacy of apartheid policies, and a legacy of the TRC, and a legacy of a transition that worked when most people in the world said it was never going to work. So it's a challenge, but it's also a wonderful learning opportunity for me and for our students who we take there, and I think for the students in South Africa to have a space where these stories can be shared and learned, and get that cross-cultural perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My name is Nancy Cordova. I'm a student here in the Peace and Justice Studies program. My question is regarding, I know that there has been several third commissions throughout the world, but the word reconciliation is very particular to the South African case. And I was wondering, my question, I actually have two questions. Do you, because the word reconciliation has a religious connotation to it, do you consider yourself a religious person, and also is South Africa a religious country?
Actually, before I talk about the personal aspect of your question, there was a TRC here in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The recently completed commission in Canada is called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The commission in Chile was called the National Commission on Truth and Reconciliation. So I think reconciliation, and I may be wrong, is an integral element of this notion of truth recovery, because it does suggest that there needs to be at least a rapprochement of the victim and the violator. So there is at least a suggestion that there's a relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. So, and if that's religious, then so be it. But I think the issue around the South African Truth Commission, and that people thought it was religious, was because it's headed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He felt that he was heading the Truth Commission not as an individual person, but as the Archbishop, the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town. So he always wore his clerical accoutrement. And he approached his work from a religious perspective. But Stephanie, I don't know how much time we have, but I have a really interesting anecdote to tell you about this thing called religion.
I'm sure everyone would love to hear it.
Yes. So you may have noticed in the image it was a colleague of mine, Faisal Randero's Muslim, but not a practicing Muslim. And Faisal was the head of the Johannesburg office, because we had divided ourselves up into the various regions in Cape Town. And Faisal was in charge of the Johannesburg office. And he, very publicly in our commission, got up and said to the Archbishop, "Now, Archbishop Desmond, you are a religious man. I'm not a religious man. So all the hearings that will be held in Johannesburg will not have a religious element to it." Archbishop says, "It's fine, absolutely fine. You don't have to worry about that, Faisal. You do it the way you want to do it." Okay? The first hearing in Johannesburg was in the Central Methodist Church in Johannesburg. That was the biggest building they could find. So I was there, the Archbishop was there, and my colleagues were there, and Faisal, of course, was going to chair. Yeah? He was going to be the person in charge. And we were standing where? In the vestry of the Methodist Church. And we prepared ourselves, and when the time came, Archbishop Desmond said to Faisal, "Come, Faisal, lead the way, it's time to go." Faisal came onto the stage and stood there. And the Archbishop looked at him, "Come, keep going." And in that time when the two of them were exchanging looks and one saying to the other, "Get going," and so on, the audience stood up and started singing a hymn. To answer your question, yes, I am a believer, but that's as far as I will leave it.
Okay, we had another question just here.
Hi, my name's Yesenia, and I'm a political science major here at USD. One of the questions that Dr. Williams kind of touched on was the education. So I was wondering how, if at all, apartheid is taught, or what how it's presented in South African education, and also if there's still programs that have to do with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that are still active today.
Yes. The Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, and I'm a member of that institute, has developed curriculum for the grade schools on apartheid, and particularly on the work of the transitional period, including the Truth Commission, and they have a very good program. And in fact, this first episode that you saw is the first video of that curriculum that is used to talk about the work. The school system, it depends where you are. So the school system has various departments depending on, very much like your states, our provinces. So the regional systems may vary from province to province. And then we also have a private school system. So in the private schools, more or less may be taught, but in the national school system, some curriculum is focused on the transitional period.
Yeah, it is new curriculum now. So I don't think anyone's being taught that apartheid was a wholesome system at its root. But there are just challenges on delivering the curriculum to many schools, especially in the rural areas. And there's also an interesting dynamic, I think, with young people where they want to have their own agency. So to some extent, some young people will tell us, they'll say, "Look, we know what our situation is here. We know it's not completely fair. We know it's linked to the past, but this is the situation we have, so we need to make the most of it." There isn't a lot of, at least in my experience in South Africa, maybe Glenda's is different, there isn't a lot of, "Oh, woe is me. I can't do anything about my situation." There is a tremendous sense of resilience in South Africans that if they made it through the period that we watched, they can make it through this period, and it's on them to continue to do that. So there's that kind of dynamic going on as well, at least from what I've observed.
Yeah.
And Mike, can you talk, and perhaps Glenda, can you talk, you mentioned Greensboro before. Can you talk about, say, the relevance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission today, and maybe the parallels that you see between what happened in South Africa and perhaps even Greensboro in the situation?
Why don't you take the first shot at
that? Please, I won't ask you if you know about the Greensboro Truth Commission. But it sometimes surprises some of the American audiences that you've had a Truth Commission in your country. And it was focusing on an event that happened in July 1979, I think, during the Civil Rights Movement. And it was the Greensburg community, actually, that decided to have a Truth Commission. So it was not a state-led commission, it was a community-led commission, which is very interesting that the community felt that they wanted to come together and deal with this event that had pulled the community apart. There was quite a lot of resistance. They tried to have the commission for a long time, and eventually were able to pull it off. And just recently celebrated the 5th year anniversary of having the commission. So I'd urge you to have a look at the details of the Greensburg Commission. I had the privilege of meeting the commissioners, who were again appointed by the community, and I thought it was a very courageous act of that particular community to have a Truth Commission. The Canadian one is they've just been able to hand in the report, and the Canadian Commission was on the education of Indigenous people in Canada. There's also been a lot of critique about that commission, and but the report is available. It's not a 7-volume report like the South African TRC's report, but it is a really good report, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of amazing similarities between South Africa and the United States in terms of race relations and systematic segregation and apartheid in both places. And what I think is, what Glenda mentioned earlier about this, the act saying it was the promotion of, not the achievement of. And in my opinion, there's something to be learned from the process of talking about such issues in public, and to having a record that everyone can at least say, we may not like the record, but this is the record of what happened. Mm-hmm. And given the events in the United States throughout our history, but even in the last year and a half, in communities like Ferguson or Baltimore, I think that's a process that would be beneficial for communities to go through, but it would take amazing political leadership and civil society leadership, and a pure aim with what it would be about, because it would not be about achieving something and all of us just singing Kumbaya together at the end, but it would be the start of a process of the healing, which I think many communities need.
I think there's someone at the back. Is that right? Yep.
Hi, my name is Meg McDonald. I'm a freshman, and I'm taking a course that studies music in South Africa. And I was just wondering, growing up in American education, I was taught a lot about the civil rights movement and all the human violations that came out of that. But apartheid was not even discussed in my schooling until, I want to say, early freshman year of my high school. And I find this kind of surprising because South Africa apartheid is a more recent and pressing subject, and also a lot of the violations seem to be even more violent and worse than that of the civil rights movement. But with the subject of race in America, what can my generation learn from the processes that the young revolutionaries took to break away from apartheid, and what's the best way to bring awareness to this?
Through music. Well, you know, there are many ways, I think, that we can learn lessons from each other. The issues around resistance and being able to be consistent in fighting for what is just and what is right. And I think that young people have the energy to do that. And they have the agency to do that. And it's about how we employ that agency to fight for what's right. But since you're a music student, did you say you're a music student? You're taking a course. You know, the struggle was fought with music, and there's a wonderful movie called Amandla, A Revolution in 4-Part Harmony. I've never been anywhere in the world where you can fill a soccer stadium and someone would start singing and the entire stadium would be singing in 4-part harmony, singing freedom songs. So, and I suppose that was the energizer as well, you know, keeping people motivated, the dance and the singing as well. So that fills me with pride when I see, even recently at the University of Cape Town, when students were protesting about colonial symbols on the campus at the university, and that these symbols should be removed. It was all done with singing and dancing as well. Yeah.
I would add, if you want to be a social rights activist, then train like a marathon runner. There were signs up in 1955 during the Defiance campaign in South Africa that said, we're going to get rid of apartheid in a year. Right? And Glenda's story, I mean, from the 1970s, fighting against the system, and then 1995 being part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you have to get involved and then stay involved and have faith that every little victory you have is a victory that's going to eventually result in that big victory you're going for.
Yeah, you have to be in it for the long haul. There's no shortcut.
Just down the front, please.
Joni Nelson, I would assume that the schools are desegregated, particularly in the big cities, but because the population was probably segregated geographically, did a lot of the whites pull their children out of public school and send them to private school that could afford to do that, which is what happened here in the South when we had the Civil Rights Act? And the education of young blacks, you mentioned the percentages that are so low in comparison to the whites in the upper levels. That leads to, I would also assume, a lot of unemployment among the population, and particularly I hear in Johannesburg that the unemployment is, I don't know, something like 40%, or which is must be a huge problem in trying to bring the races together.
Yes. Yes, that did happen when the schools and the health facilities and all the other facilities were desegregated and deracialized. Many people fled the country. We had a terrible brain drain. Your country, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the recipients of some of our brightest minds, Israel. And people feared, you know, the black fear. Huh? A black government would just destroy and annihilate. And so lots of people fled. Many private schools were formed, and people sent their children to private schools. And we had a system where they called it Model C schools, and these were schools who, in the old era, had accepted a limited amount of families or children from other races. These were white schools that had accepted people from other races. So these Model C schools then started growing, where a lot of the parents who could afford to send their children to better schools would send them to these Model C schools. But the fees in those Model C schools were exceptionally high, very, very high. So it was only the new elite that were able to afford to send their children to these better schools. Mm-hmm. The percentage about unemployment is not general unemployment is 40%, but they're estimating that amongst graduates, black graduates either from high school or from university, there's a 40% unemployment rate, which is a staggering statistic.
We're almost out of time, so I want to make sure that we get some final comments from you both. And then if you can stay till the very end, I would highly recommend that we have a special treat for you. So, final comments.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you for allowing me to be part of this. And thank Glenda. It's just been a real honor to share this space, and I think USD is honored to have people like yourself and the other women peacemakers here. For someone who first started learning about South African politics with Professor Jim Gump, who's in the audience, many years ago, it's still an amazing place for us to think about the prospects for political and social change and the limits of that change. And while it's out of the headlines sometimes now, except when bad things happen, I still think it's a place that we as American citizens and we as global citizens can learn a lot of lessons about what's possible and about how a society can pull itself out of a situation that looked like it was going to be endemic violent revolution to a place that today is relatively stable and prospering, and it's, in my opinion, on the road still to good things. So thank you, and if you're students out there, I'd encourage you to come talk to me about coming to South Africa this summer. Even if you're not students, come talk to me. We can take trips to South Africa together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark.
So it's always a great honor and privilege to be able to talk to you. I found the last few weeks really incredible, and there were so many wonderful, deep, thoughtful questions that have come our way. I know, as Mike said, South Africa may be off the radar screen at the moment. I am incredibly proud that our transition was managed by ourselves. We did not have any external facilitators, United Nations, Matia Tisari, whoever, to facilitate our transition, and it was done. And it does say something about leadership, and of course, we had the iconic leadership of Nelson Mandela, but there were many, in fact, leaders who are not known, who are unsung, who have been part of this process. And I am privileged that, I was there somewhere in the corridors, or being part of, in my metaphor, being the midwife in this process of a birth of a new democracy.